Can a movie from Hollywood's golden era still feel dangerous today? Behind the glamour, bright studio lights, and elegant stars were films that frightened censors, angered churches, shocked parents, and forced audiences to confront subjects they were told never to discuss. These movies crossed lines through crime, desire, race, rebellion, religion, and hidden cruelty. And the number one film remains so controversial. Hollywood still struggles with its shadow culto. Number 15. The Miracle, 1948. One short film created a legal storm bigger than many Hollywood epics. The Miracle did not shock audiences with violence or spectacle. It disturbed people through faith, doubt, and interpretation. Directed by Roberto Rossellini and starring Anna Magnani, the story follows a troubled woman who believes she has experienced something sacred after meeting a mysterious stranger. To some viewers, it was a serious drama about suffering and belief. To others, it felt offensive, even blasphemous. That disagreement turned the film into a censorship battlefield. Religious groups protested, officials tried to suppress it, and the controversy eventually helped push cinema towards stronger artistic protection. What made The Miracle so powerful was the question behind the scandal. Should a movie be silenced just because it offends powerful moral voices? It crossed the line because it challenged the old idea that religion, authority, and public outrage could decide what art was allowed to say. Number 14. The Moon is Blue, 1953. A light romantic comedy somehow became a direct attack on Hollywood's moral rulebook. The Moon is Blue looked polished, witty, and harmless, but its casual discussion of desire and adult relationships terrified the production code. Otto Preminger refused to soften the film just to please censors, and when the code denied its approval, he released it anyway. That decision turned a clever drawing room comedy into one of the decade's biggest censorship battles. The controversy was not about shocking images. It was about words, implication, and the terrifying idea that grown-ups on screen might speak honestly instead of pretending innocence. Audiences became curious because the film had been labeled dangerous, and its success proved that censorship did not always control public taste. The Moon is Blue crossed the line because it showed how fragile old Hollywood morality really was. Something that feels mild today once looked like rebellion, and that made the movie a quiet but important crack in the censorship wall. Number 13. Blackboard Jungle, 1955. The classroom door opened, and old America heard the sound of rebellion. Blackboard Jungle was not just a school drama. It was a warning siren aimed at parents, teachers, censors, and anyone who believed youth could still be controlled by authority alone. Glenn Ford plays a new teacher entering a violent, restless school where the rules have already started collapsing. The students are not presented as simple villains. They are angry, bored, wounded, and dangerous in a way that made audiences deeply uneasy. Then came the music. The blast of rock and roll at the beginning turned the film into something larger than a classroom story. Suddenly, it felt like the soundtrack of a new generation smashing through the walls of polite society. Adults feared it would encourage bad behavior. Some theaters reportedly faced rowdy reactions. Critics and moral watchdogs argued over whether the film exposed a real crisis or sensationalized it. That tension made Blackboard Jungle impossible to ignore. It crossed the line because it showed young people not as innocent background figures, but as a force powerful enough to frighten the entire culture. For Golden Era Hollywood, that was dangerous. The movie understood that rebellion was no longer hiding in dark alleys. It had entered the classroom, turned up the volume, and dared authority to answer back. Number 12. The Wild One, 1953. One leather jacket became more frightening to old Hollywood than a room full of gangsters. The Wild One turned Marlon Brando into the face of youth rebellion, and audiences could feel the cultural ground shifting under his motorcycle wheels. Brando's Johnny Strabler was not a clean hero, not a simple villain, and not a young man begging to be understood. He was detached, moody, unpredictable, and quietly magnetic. That made him dangerous. The film follows a motorcycle gang that rolls into a small town and disrupts its fragile sense of order. But the real fear was not only the gang. It was what Johnny represented, young people who no longer cared about approval. The famous question, "What are you rebelling against?" And the answer, "What have you got?" became a generational threat in one line. Censors and conservative voices worried the film glamorized delinquency, lawlessness, and disrespect for authority. In some places, it faced bans and restrictions because it seemed to invite imitation. But that is exactly why it lasted. The Wild One crossed the line by making rebellion look stylish, lonely, and seductive without fully condemning it. It captured the fear that the next generation would not politely inherit society's rules. They might roar into town, stare down the adults, and leave behind a new kind of cool. Number 11. The Outlaw, 1943. The scandal began before many people had even seen the movie. The Outlaw became famous not simply as a Western, but as a publicity war between censorship, advertising, and Hollywood's obsession with image. Howard Hughes knew exactly how to turn controversy into attention, and the film's promotion centered heavily on Jane Russell, whose screen presence became the subject of endless moral debate. On paper, the story was about Billy the Kid, Doc Holliday, rivalry, loyalty, and danger on the frontier. But the public conversation was hijacked by suggestive posters, costume choices, camera angles, and the question of whether Hollywood was deliberately provoking the censors. The production code objected, delays followed, and the film's reputation grew larger than the film itself. That was the real genius of the controversy. The Outlaw proved that scandal could be manufactured, sold, and used as a marketing weapon. Audiences lined up partly because they were told there was something forbidden inside. The film crossed the line because it turned censorship into advertisement. Instead of hiding from moral outrage, it fed on it. For Golden Era Hollywood, that was a dangerous lesson. The studio system liked control, polish, and carefully managed glamour. The Outlaw showed that forbidden glamour could be even more profitable. It made controversy part of the box office, and Hollywood never forgot the trick. Number 10. Duel in the Sun, 1946. This Western did not ride into theaters like a clean frontier adventure. It arrived hot, excessive, and already surrounded by whispers. Duel in the Sun was nicknamed Lust in the Dust, and that reputation tells you exactly why it unsettled Golden Era audiences. David O. Selznick built the film as a giant Technicolor spectacle, but beneath the sweeping landscapes and expensive production was a story burning with jealousy, obsession, family conflict, and emotional violence. Jennifer Jones Pearl Chavez became the center of the storm, a woman trapped between desire, social judgment, and men who wanted to possess or control her. Gregory Peck, playing against his usual noble image, brought a dangerous arrogance to Luke McCannell's, turning romance into something darker and more unstable. The film pushed against the boundaries of what a mainstream Western was supposed to be. Instead of honor, clean heroism, and moral simplicity, it gave audiences heat, shame, and destructive passion. Censors objected to its suggestive tone, while critics attacked its melodrama and excess. But audiences were drawn to the very thing that made it controversial. Duel in the Sun crossed the line because it transformed the Western from a morality tale into an emotional furnace. It proved that the frontier could be a place of obsession, not just courage. Under its bright colors, the movie had the pulse of a scandal. Number 9. Suddenly, Last Summer, 1959. Some secrets in old Hollywood were not spoken directly. They were hidden in shadows, coded lines, and rooms where everyone looked afraid of the truth. Suddenly, Last Summer turned that silence into a fever. Based on Tennessee Williams' work, the film follows a young woman whose memory of a shocking death threatens to expose a wealthy family's carefully protected image. Elizabeth Taylor brings vulnerability and fire to Catherine, while Katharine Hepburn's Violet Venable moves through the story like a guardian of privilege, denial, and control. The controversy came from what the film suggested, rather than what it openly stated. Beneath its polished surface were themes of mental cruelty, family repression, exploitation, and forbidden truth, all wrapped in Southern Gothic elegance. For Golden Era audiences, this was dangerous material. The movie pushed against the limits of the production code by turning psychological horror into social accusation. It asked what powerful families are willing to bury, and what happens to the person who remembers too much. Montgomery Clift's quiet presence added another layer of tension, making the film feel like an interrogation disguised as a drama. Suddenly, Last Summer crossed the line because it made respectability look monstrous. It showed that the most frightening scandals were not always in the streets. Sometimes they lived inside mansions, behind polite voices, waiting for one broken witness to speak. Number 8. Island of Lost Souls, 1932. This was not just a horror film. It was a laboratory nightmare, wearing the face of a moral warning. Island of Lost Souls dragged audiences into the world of Dr. Moreau, a scientist whose experiments twist nature into something deeply unsettling. Charles Lawton's performance made Moreau terrifying, not because he shouted, but because he treated cruelty like scientific progress. That cold confidence made the film feel dangerous. For early 1930s audiences, the story pushed against fears of evolution, body transformation, medical arrogance, and the idea that mankind could play creator without consequence. The atmosphere was thick with dread, shadowy cages, strange cries, half-human figures, and the unforgettable chant of, "Are we not men?" The film disturbed censors because it touched too many raw nerves at once. It suggested that civilization could be thin, that science could lose its soul, and that identity itself could be broken apart. Some countries banned it, while others saw it as too grotesque, too cruel, or too blasphemous in its implications. But that is exactly why it remained powerful. Island of Lost Souls crossed the line because it turned classic horror into an argument about human limits. It was not simply asking what monsters look like. It was asking who creates them, who controls them, and what happens when power is used without mercy. Long before modern horror became graphic, this film proved that an idea could be more disturbing than any image. Its controversy came from fear, but its legacy came from the question it refused to bury. Number 7. The Story of Temple Drake, 1933. Some films feel controversial because they show too much. This one felt dangerous because it suggested what Hollywood was terrified to say aloud. The Story of Temple Drake came from William Faulkner's dark Southern material, and it brought a level of menace that made the pre-code era feel almost reckless. Miriam Hopkins plays Temple, a privileged young woman pulled into a world of crime, fear, and moral collapse. The film's power comes from its atmosphere: shadowed rooms, dangerous men, social disgrace, and the feeling that one night can destroy an entire identity. At a time when Hollywood was still testing the limits of what could be shown, Temple Drake became a symbol of why stricter censorship was coming. It dealt with violation, corruption, reputation, and survival in ways that were far too intense for later production code standards. The film did not need to explain everything directly. Its silences were part of the terror. Audiences understood what was being implied, and that made the story even more disturbing. What makes it important is how it exposed the hypocrisy of respectability. Temple's world pretends to be protected by class and manners, but those protections collapse the moment real danger enters. The story of Temple Drake crossed the line because it forced Golden Era audiences to face the darker side of power and shame. It turned a society woman's fall into a nightmare about control, silence, and judgment. For old Hollywood, that was not just scandalous, it was almost too honest. Number 6. The Public Enemy, 1931. Before Hollywood learned how to punish gangsters properly, this film made one look dangerously alive. The Public Enemy arrived during the early sound era, when crime pictures were becoming faster, harder, and more exciting than many moral guardians could tolerate. James Cagney's Tom Powers was not a distant villain in a shadowy melodrama. He was sharp, physical, funny, cruel, ambitious, and full of street energy. That was the problem. Audiences were not only warned by him, they were fascinated by him. The film showed crime as ugly and destructive, but it also captured the thrill of rising fast, in a world built on poverty, anger, and opportunity. Censors worried that movies like this could make underworld figures seem glamorous, especially to young viewers living through hard economic times. The violence, the arrogance, and the famous grapefruit moment all helped build the film's dangerous reputation. But underneath the shock was a grim social portrait. Tom Powers is not born in luxury. He comes from pressure, resentment, and the hunger to become someone feared. The Public Enemy crossed the line because it made criminal ambition feel like a dark version of the American dream. It showed that society's outcasts could become celebrities on screen, even when their stories ended badly. For Golden Era Hollywood, that was a risky spell to cast. The film helped create the gangster myth while pretending to condemn it, and that contradiction made it unforgettable. It warned audiences about crime, but first it made sure they could not look away. Number 5. Scarface, 1932. Scarface did not whisper about crime. It fired its warning like a machine gun into the heart of old Hollywood. Howard Hawks' gangster Landmark became one of the most controversial films of its time because it pushed the crime genre to a new level of speed, brutality, and swagger. Paul Muni's Tony Camonte was inspired by the public fear surrounding real underworld bosses, and the film barely disguised its fascination with violent power. That fascination terrified censors. The movie presented crime as chaotic and destructive, but it also gave Tony a terrifying charisma. He was ruthless, childish, ambitious, and almost mythic in his hunger for control. The censors demanded changes, delays, warnings, and moral framing, because they feared audiences might see the gangster not as a cautionary figure, but as an outlaw star. The result was a film that feels like it is fighting with censorship while it plays. Every burst of violence, every shadowy deal, every climb toward power carries the feeling of a system losing control. Scarface crossed the line because it exposed how thin the difference could be between condemnation and attraction. It asked audiences to watch a monster rise, then dared them to admit the rise was exciting. That was the nightmare for moral watchdogs. The film did not simply depict lawlessness, it gave lawlessness style, rhythm, and cinematic force. Even with warnings attached, Scarface became a blueprint for gangster cinema. It proved that crime on screen could be both a moral lesson and a forbidden pleasure, and that double edge made it dangerous. Number 4. Ecstasy, 1933. One young actress, one moment of forbidden honesty, and the whole world started talking. Ecstasy became one of the most notorious international films of the 1930s, not because it had a huge plot or a violent scandal, but because it showed emotion and physical awakening with a boldness that censors were not prepared to accept. Hedy Lamarr, years before becoming a Hollywood icon, appeared in a story about a young woman trapped in an unhappy marriage and drawn toward a life that feels more alive. The film's controversy came from its imagery, its atmosphere, and the suggestion that female desire could be treated seriously on screen. That idea alone was explosive. In many places, the film was cut, condemned, or discussed more as a scandal than as a work of cinema. Moral authorities objected to its frankness, while audiences were drawn to the very reputation that made it forbidden. But Ecstasy was not just a publicity sensation. It challenged the way early cinema portrayed women's inner lives. Instead of presenting its heroine as a simple object of judgment, it gave her longing, frustration, and choice. That made the film feel modern in a way the old rules could not contain. Ecstasy crossed the line because it treated private feeling as something worthy of cinematic attention. It suggested that a woman's emotional and romantic life belonged to her, not to society's comfort. For censors, that was dangerous. For film history, it was unforgettable. The scandal faded, but the image of cinema breaking free remained. Number 3. Freaks, 1932. The real horror of Freaks was not under the circus lights, it was in the audience's own reaction. Todd Browning's film remains one of the strangest and most controversial works of early Hollywood, because it refused to treat difference in a simple, comfortable way. Instead of using makeup or fantasy creatures, Browning cast real sideshow performers and placed them at the emotional center of the story. That choice shocked audiences who were used to looking at such people as spectacle, not as characters with loyalty, humor, pain, and dignity. The film begins almost like a backstage drama, showing a closed community with its own rules and bonds. But as betrayal enters the story, the tone darkens into something unforgettable. Test audiences reportedly reacted with horror, the studio cut the film, and its reputation collapsed for years, before later critics reclaimed it as a misunderstood classic. What made Freaks so disturbing was its moral reversal. The people society labels strange are not the true villains. The real cruelty comes from greed, mockery, and the belief that some lives are worth less than others. That idea was too sharp for many viewers in the 1930s. Freaks crossed the line because it forced audiences to confront the ugliness of their own gaze. It asked them why they were uncomfortable, and then refused to let them escape the answer. What was once dismissed as grotesque now feels strangely compassionate and radical. The film's controversy came from shock, but its lasting power comes from empathy wrapped in nightmare. It knew exactly where the monster was hiding, and it was not where audiences expected. Number 2. Baby Doll, 1956. A film can be quiet, southern, and almost playful, yet still make an entire moral establishment panic. Baby Doll became one of the defining censorship scandals of the 1950s because it turned suggestion into a weapon. Directed by Elia Kazan and shaped by the heated atmosphere of Tennessee Williams, the film takes place in a world of decaying homes, fragile marriages, business revenge, and emotional games that feel more dangerous the longer they continue. Carol Baker's Baby Doll became the center of the controversy, not because the movie shouted its scandal, but because it made innocence, desire, manipulation, and power feel disturbingly tangled. Carl Malden and Eli Wallach add pressure from opposite sides, creating a triangle of resentment and temptation that made audiences feel like they were listening through a wall. Religious groups condemned the film, moral watchdogs attacked it, and its advertising only made the scandal burn hotter. But the real danger of Baby Doll was its refusal to behave like a traditional Hollywood drama. It did not cleanly punish, explain, or soften the discomfort. It let the atmosphere sweat. It allowed pauses, glances, and half-spoken threats to carry the charge. Baby Doll crossed the line because it proved that old Hollywood controversy did not need explicit display. It could live in tone, implication, and the uneasy feeling that everyone in the room understood more than they were saying. The film helped expose the weakening power of the production code and showed that adult tension could not be locked away forever. Its scandal was not loud. It was slow, sticky, and impossible to ignore. Number 1. Song of the South, 1946. The most controversial Golden Era film on this list does not look dangerous at first glance, and that is exactly what makes it so troubling. Song of the South was built as a family picture, mixing live action, animation, music, and folklore into a warm studio package. But beneath that polished surface sat a problem Disney could never fully escape. The film presented a nostalgic vision of the American South that softened historical wounds and avoided the brutal realities behind the world it portrayed. For many viewers and critics, that made the film not just outdated, but deeply uncomfortable. James Baskett's performance as Uncle Remus carried warmth, dignity, and historic importance, yet the film around him framed the past through a sentimental lens that later generations found impossible to separate from racial fantasy. That contradiction turned Song of the South into a studio ghost, famous, influential, referenced, remembered, but largely withheld from modern release. Its songs and animated characters remained part of Disney memory, while the film itself became something the company rarely wanted to discuss directly. Song of the South crossed the line because its controversy was hidden inside charm. It did not shock through violence, crime, or scandalous dialogue. It disturbed because it asked audiences to feel comfort in a version of history that left too much pain outside the frame. That is why it belongs at number 1, not because it is the loudest film on the list, but because its legacy shows how dangerous nostalgia can be when it turns injustice into a bedtime story. These Golden Era films prove that controversy did not begin with modern cinema. It was already hiding behind velvet curtains, studio smiles, and polished black and white frames. Some films broke censorship rules, some exposed uncomfortable truths, and others left wounds that never fully disappeared. But which one crossed the line hardest? Drop your pick and subscribe for more forgotten Hollywood scandals.